All right, let's start with idealism here. And to help keep things a little more organized visually, what I'm going to do is assign purple to the idealists, and I'll draw a rectangle, and I'll put idealism kind of on these four spectrum here, where the idealists stand in terms of these purple rectangles. On the metaphysical issues here, the idealists are tending strongly toward the supernatural side of the spectrum here. So I'm going to put them here, and so they stake out a certain amount of territory. The degree of supernaturalism and distance from naturalism can vary among idealists. Right? Idealists are an ancient school, and there have been many variations on idealist themes. But nonetheless, what the idealists share in common with each other metaphysically is a disagreement with the naturalistic approach and an emphasis on our having to understand the world in terms of a realm beyond the natural world. Now, it's a little more complicated, as one might expect in philosophy, because idealists can disagree with themselves or among themselves over any number of issues. One of the big divides in the history of idealist thought is between the kind of idealists who are more explicitly religious in their idealism and those that are not explicitly religious in their idealism, or who, while they will agree with many of the central insights and metaphysical approaches of religious schools of thought, don't believe perhaps in a personal God or personal gods, or in any way personalize what they take the higher supernatural realm to be. So, for example, we might have very strong supernaturalists, say the Western monotheistic religious traditions. They will speak of a God who is a person who has beliefs and cares about us and is actively managing our affairs in many respects. Some of the idealists, though, when they're talking about the supernatural realm, won't speak of it in personal terms at all. They will speak of being, right, with a capital B, or ultimate reality, and there's no presuppositions there that ultimate reality is aware of our existence or has any particular value connection to us. So, with those general qualifications in mind, just idealists are somewhere along this part of the spectrum here. Now, that distinction is important, though, because when we turn to epistemological issues, while the idealists share a distrust of, or in some cases an outright opposition to, what we might call a principled scientific empirical approach to reason, they also will vary, right, in their degrees of distancing self from that realism. It is true to say that in the more religious versions of idealism, faith is given strong emphasis. The higher truths are either completely inaccessible to reason. Reason is, from that perspective, not able to understand the supernatural realm at all. Or in some cases, what one is to believe epistemologically about the higher realm is something that is contrary or contradictory to reason. And so in the strong versions of faith, such as we saw with Kierkegaard, for example, a strong advocacy of faith requires that one deny altogether reason. However, some of the idealists are more reason-friendly, and what they will advocate is a position that is, I'm going to call it somewhere in around here, kind of a pure reason position. That is to say, a reason purified of empirical sensory observations. And so in that sense, they are more reason-friendly, and they won't believe that we should accept everything on faith. But nonetheless, it's not the hardcore principled science approach to reason. So we'll just say that the idealists tend to stake out this part of the spectrum, right, epistemologically. Without exception, the idealists tend strongly to dualism. Some of them might make a move in some direction toward integrationism, but typically the idealists will see the human being as a microcosm of the metaphysical, and if the metaphysical is partly natural and partly supernatural, or partly physical and partly spiritual, then they will see the human being in those same dualistic terms. And then when we turn to ethics, most of the advocates of idealism are in varying degrees altruistic. Some of them are incorporating and moving in some direction toward egoism, the idea being that one can, for example, in religious idealism, achieve bliss, personal bliss in heaven, and that's an ultimate reward for living the good life. Some of them are more strongly renunciatory, arguing that ethics is strictly a matter of duty, sacrifice, renunciation, without any emphasis on a personal reward at all. Instead, one is to devote oneself to the service of others, to the service of God, or to the other people. And for the non-religious versions of idealism, there tends to be the same sort of array, so ending up in this part of the spectrum, so to speak. All right, let me shift color and take up realism and do the same thing here. By realism, we'll be looking at idealism's longest running historical adversary, the earliest religious traditions, and the Platonists are representative of idealism here. Realism begins philosophically most significantly with Aristotle, and Aristotle was a student of Plato's, and so it's not as old as idealism, but it nearly is so. Realists in their metaphysics tend to the naturalistic end of the spectrum here. Some of them will be non-supernaturalistic altogether. It is possible as a realist to be religious, and so we will put an arrow saying that one can go in this direction here. But the kind of religion, the kind of God that realists will believe in typically is very different than the kind of God and the kind of religion that comes out of supernaturalism, or sort of out of idealism, supernaturalism. We'll say more about that when we talk about the differences between the two in a later unit here. The realists in their epistemology are typically opponents of faith, typically advocates of reason, typically advocates of empirical reason, scientific method, and so forth. Some of them, again, who are religious, will argue that a compromise position is worked out or can be worked out between reason and faith, that there are two ways of coming to the same sets of truths. So among some realists, there's a tendency to make a compromise with faith here, but nonetheless, for the realists, reason is almost always given at least first pride of place philosophically here. All of the major realists in their view of human nature have tended to integrationism, staking out this middle territory here. Some of them will lean in a dualistic direction, some of them will lean in a reductive materialist direction, but you tend not to find either of the extremes among the realists. You find them then, so to speak, in the middle of the road here. In the ethics, what we will find is most of the realists are advocates of a kind of egoism, Aristotle advocating a pursuit of happiness, self-realization kind of ethic. John Locke in the modern world is an example of realism here, again arguing for liberty of the individual, pursuit of happiness as the human birthright. Some of them also will tend a little bit toward altruism, but the point is that realists tend to hang out and live comfortably in this part of the spectrum. All right, let me change color again.